Michael Irons and the Great Continent by Nathan Moore. Chapter 15 Demonic Temple. Even in the deep jungles of the Asian subcontinent, a place of sufficient consequence would radiate recognizable spiritual energies. To Michael Irons, his ability to seek and detect the sensation of evil, great or small, layer upon layer, pressing down and enshrouding a place of unspeakable wickedness, was unremarkable. A modest capability developed from the simple familiarity comparable to how the layman would see a terraced rice paddy in the Orient, while one familiar with architecture would easily recognize and identify the stepped hill in question to actually be an overgrown pyramid. Thus, when Irons found himself walking toward an extensively overgrown cave, he knew well approaching it to, in truth, be a temple of ancient construction. The hills and immense trees be forest-choked towers and cathedral-sized rooms. And more importantly, there was a near-palpable aura that resonated with profound evil. Greatsword in his right hand, flintlock ready in his left, Irons with caution stepped across the obscured temple's entrance. "Who disturbs my slumber?" The booming, monstrous voice resonated around Irons as if the hall into which he stepped were a giant's throat. He paused his step a moment, considered briefly, then turned back toward the entrance while taking out a pouch of salt. Using his colonial hunting knife, he began to tear at roots and turn up dirt until, finding where the stone floor met the broad pillars of the door's base on either side, his cocked flintlock aimed down the hall. Nothing could be seen in the darkness. The lips of Irons pressed thin. A common demon would have rushed toward freedom the moment it realized his intent to seal and trap it. But this one had moved cautiously, mindfully provoking Irons to act and tip his proverbial hand, allowing the demon to infer much about the black-clad man's knowledge and capabilities from that single action. Not terribly fond of facing an enemy cunning enough to test him, Irons kept the flintlock raised as he poured the salt, forming an unbroken line in the entrance, frame to exposed frame, effectively, if temporarily, trapping the demon inside. The frown deepened as Irons scowled into the dark. "Can I not convince you to allow me to finish this swiftly?" uttered Irons, knowing full well the reply. Silence. Very well. He stood, pistol in his obsidian rosary-wrapped hand, ivory crucifix presented. "Cat and mouse it is, then, and folly if you deem me the mouse." Irons prepared a lit torch and began to move with purpose, stepped deeper into the ancient temple, the fire's light flickering over the weirdly intricate and grotesque carvings which densely adorned what sections of the archaic wall peeked from the vegetation and moss, scenes of gruesome ritual, degenerate worship, and bloody sacrifice. Through vaulted antechamber and prolonged corridor did Irons stalk the great evil. Deeper did the temple become, and darker the weight of oppression upon his soul, and the fingers of Irons trembled with fear and excitement, for long had it been since such a wickedness weighed so heavily on his spirit. There, from the dark, abrupt toward him lunged a long maw, which yawned toward him so vast and wide all other features from the eyes of Irons were hid. Without hesitation, flintlock erupted. The powder burst, cast its load, and the roof of the manifested demon's mouth was at once awash in blood and ichor. The great sword of Irons was drawn before the discarded pistol reached the floor, and good this was, for, despite its wound, the vast span of its arms reached down at him like twin oaks, their unnatural flesh a dark, roiling red, as if held within were the eternal flames of hell itself. Profound power and evil emanated from the creature, and Irons felt as if a great forge's fire was suddenly opened before him, the abrupt heat palpable, striking him like a gale. The abominable manifestation descended upon Irons with a roar of fire, not scorching him only for the gore which boiled and sputtered from its wounded mouth. its hulking form demonic, and so large it was obliged to stoop even within this great hall. With a thrill, the heart of iron sung as his soul rose up to meet this great evil. Obsidian beads of his rosary wrapped around his hand, ivory crucifix swaying, Irons raised his great sword with both hands and lunged toward the vast foe. The great blade came down upon the corded muscles of the fiend's arms, scoring them, drawing steaming blood, but the wound inflicted was too shallow to even leave a scar. The beast's shock at being wounded made its arm lash out, reflexive, with a bellow of shock rather than pain, catching Irons solidly in the chest. Only by lunging away with the blow did he avoid shattered ribs, but the dull ache of even a shallow breath told him of bruising at least. However, this thought was already held down in his subconscious as his blood raced with battle lust, and his blue eyes grew wide and frenzied as he threw himself against the great creature, now settling into a rhythm of combat. When the demon swung, he dodged and let his blade press against whatever infernal flesh passed by. When the beast attempted to protect itself, Irons lashed out cunningly, never overextending himself and avoiding returning blows. But throughout, no mortal wounds were inflicted, and Irons remained coldly aware that the gleaming yellow eyes of his opponent continued to remain fixed upon him, studying, probing, plotting, looking for a chance to bait the black-clad man into a fatal mistake. And even if no mistake were made, simple exhaustion could eventually be the downfall of Irons, as the wolfish man realized that the first blow he had struck was slowly, but noticeably, attempting to heal. Even as he began to try and concentrate his attacks on a leg and an arm, hoping to chip away at them as a forester attacks a mighty pine, there was, he saw, never an opportunity to inflict a similar barrage upon the neck or skull. All this happened within the span of seconds, at which point during a particular dodge, Irons swept naked hand into his cloak, retrieved holy water with emotion, and cast it, flask and all, into the face of the manifest demon. A howl of pain and rage so shrill as to nearly make one's ears bleed rent the air as the beast clapped both hands over its face, and Irons lunged. While granted a window, he knew swift strength was key now, for while agony was inflicted, the demon's manifestation would melt like a slug under salt in such conditions. And yet, while the creature screamed and its skin fumed as if one severely burned, it did not melt, demonstrating once more that this demon was beyond any of its kind he had managed to confront in battle. This might be his one chance. His hands steady from decades of war against evil, and in rapid succession, Irons first threw his final flask of holy water, reinvigorating the agony of his foe. Then, before the flask hit the ground, his second pistol was drawn and fired from the waist, catching the monstrosity in its neck, obliterating near half the thick, warped flesh away. But this was a demon, and not so easily felled. Thus, before the powder had even begun to disperse, through the black fumes of his shot flew Irons at his enemy, and with as strong a swing as his arms and body and legs could throw, his great sword sung, heavily hewing the beast's head from its neck entirely. Fragments of flesh and nerve seemed to waver from the severed neck, as if to grasp for the great head as it toppled free, and indeed the creature's monstrous hands numbly reached out automatically, but Irons was swifter. He seized the boulder-side head, heaving it aside by the jet-black mane, for it was far too heavy to hold. Then, rosary-wrapped hand grasping his hunting knife and a holy benediction on his lips, down plunged the blade into the demon's madly twitching head. All at once the body and the face went rigid, then relaxed slowly into death. The great form collapsed onto its knees, then fell on its chest, as the head's eyes rolled back into its skull. When the last weak throb of its heart stilled, there came the smell of sulfur and brimstone. Irons swiftly stepped away and watched, reclaimed torch held high, as the body seemed to burn. Yet instead of being consumed, it was as if it were drawn from this plane toward elsewhere. Indeed, once the final crackling embers died and the fetid scent ceased, not even ashes remained. In the aftermath, Irons roamed the halls of the temple, mindfully laying a trail behind so he might easily find his way out. With a prayer over the deceased who the demon had crushed and devoured, Irons put the blighted temple to the torch, then exited, ready to resume his wanderings.